Someone in Oxford defined munus as follows. In the sense most commonly encountered in our sources, munus, plural munera, means a public service rendered by a citizen to his community in the form, for instance, of a financial donation, military service, or holding of public office. But the term munera covered an extraordinarily wide range of public duties. An especially notable munus was the organizing and financing of gladiatorial shows, for which the term munera became shorthand. Well, around 1,800 years ago, someone in Thursdays was especially proud of their service to the people, so much so that they had it commemorated upon the ground of their home. There, painted upon the floor tiles of the reception hall, for all the residents and guests of the house to see, a scene unfolded, the sight of which would chase most modern guests or buyers out of the property. People being fed to lions. Yet the method by which this horrible act is depicted to have been carried out might raise your brow. These condemned, criminals, slaves, unfortunates, haven't been thrown onto the lion-riddled sand with the understanding that nature and time will take their course, but rather are being held in place by lion handlers while the lions work. This is a display of power over humans, of power over monsters. What is a lion if not a monster to a Roman without the Discovery Channel? What is a Roman if not a monster to a Londoner without the Flavian Amphitheatre? Much of the rest of the mosaic does not survive to our day, but is believed to have likely been a more comprehensive celebration of the largesse and accordant wealth of the master of the house, depicting other gifts and public services of this person who so generously fed the urges of the people. This artistic depiction of damnatio ad bestias sure fits holistically into the larger image its patron wished to present, but much more importantly, it fits holistically into the fabric of both familiar and extremely alien Roman belief systems, and shines the light of history upon a dark corner of the human story, the blood sports of Rome. That wording isn't as gratuitously sensationalist as you might think if you're someone without a general acquaintance of Roman history. The capital punishments of Rome have in earnest and a whole corner to themselves in the whole of human horrors. No pre-modern society can boast the scale, the systematization, the sophistication, the utter scientification of grand cruelty that Rome put on display. And so a question arises, what in Hades is wrong with these people? Academics like to answer this question. Various social, moral, psychological resolutions are on offer. Two directions of thought strike out farther than the others in the discourse. Some emphasize the religious foundation and characterization of early culture of Roman spectacle. It is theorized that the Romans appropriated Etruscan customs, such as their gladiatorial games, that in Etruria had a religious significance to do with death and funerals. This was indeed the nature of early Roman gladiatorial shows. So for the Romans, it was from the get-go a very cultic affair, and it maintained vestiges of that quality into the imperial period. For the gods are cruel, and so are their creations. Other scholars emphasize rather the secular, militaristic culture of Rome that encouraged aggression, domination, acclimatization to murder, and the principle of the rights of the strong over the weak, a principle at odds with the evolution of Roman law that ebbed and flowed around the rights of the many, of the weak, of the rightless. Plebeians, foreigners, captives, slaves, the impaired, even criminals would at times accumulate legal consideration. Ideological contradictions, ethical incongruities, irreconcilabilities of various kinds were not always accounted for in the collective Roman psyche. So it is creditable to say that the fabric of Roman belief systems was knotty and not without gaps. Summa Supplicia the ultimate punishments, namely crucifixion, immolation, and death by being fed alive to animals, were the apex penalties reserved largely for non-citizens of Rome. They form one of those knots in the ideological fabric of Rome when tied into Roman claims of moral superiority over barbarous barbarians, who are stripped in Roman cultural perspective of civilized properties like dignified restraint or gravitas, the inclination to distinguish good from evil, or virtus, which at least acknowledges the badness of evil, even if it doesn't define and demarcate it to a degree satisfactory to us. The esteeming of clementia, or mercy, one of the virtues Julius Caesar was celebrated and then worshipped for, and the acclamation of budding ideas of egalitarianism, manifested in democratic ideals that advised the sharing of the aristocracy's kratos with the demos, a system to which Polybius attributed Rome's stability and success. All of these are in one way or another in conflict with the ultimate punishments. Feeding a disenfranchised person to a jaguar for a good day out is neither restrained nor nitpicky with evil, nebulous and unenthusiastic though its definition may be, nor overly merciful, nor especially considerate of even the more primitive forms of equalitarianism. For a person of modern values, in understanding the callousness of such acts as spectating or enacting such evils as the Summa Supplicia, it might serve to peruse the chapters of Hannah Arendt's book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, which mulls the testimonies in the trial that took place in 1961 in Jerusalem of the recently captured Adolf Eichmann, one of the coordinators of the Holocaust. In that book, one might read the following words: "Evil comes from a failure to think. It defies thought, for as soon as thought tries to engage itself with evil and examine the premises and principles from which it originates, it is frustrated because it finds nothing there. That is the banality of evil." She later elaborates, "For when I speak of the banality of evil, I do so only on the strictly factual level, pointing to a phenomenon which stared one in the face at the trial. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been farther from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain, except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement. He had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of those greatest criminals of that period. And if this is banal or even funny, if with the best will in the world one cannot extract any diabolical or demonic profundity from Eichmann, this is still far from calling it commonplace. That such remoteness from reality and such thoughtlessness can wreak more havoc than all the evil instincts taken together, which perhaps are inherent in a man. That was in fact the lesson one could learn in Jerusalem. In the organization by the Romans of the games where human lives and sensations would be toyed with for the public's gratification of those evil instincts inherent in a man, in the cases where it wasn't done with pleasure, it was done often by emotionally remote, thoughtless organizers as their jobs as line handlers, guards, accountants, scouts, promoters, or above the riffraff, done for the concurrent advancement of one's public career that immunus grants. Crosses would be planted along the roads to large urban centers, to act as billboards, to advertise the sadistic delights to be found therein, and within, at the amphitheaters, queues of delatores or informants could be seen, hoping to claim a reward for helping condemn somebody, like some sort of Stalinist capitalists, some doing so in the practice of a profession as an informant that they would take up for its financial remunerations, which could provide a steady income. In this sort of mundane, banal way, people would be brought to suffer, and people would be brought to watch them suffer. The modern reconstruction of a classical form of a day of games begins with the morning venationes, or the huntings, where wild animals would be hunted by appropriately equipped men. This would be followed by lunchtime executions, wherein a variety of modes were employed to kill the condemned, not least the feeding of inappropriately equipped men and women to wild animals. Then would follow the conclusive stage of the games, the gladiatorial combat. This reconstruction of this standard program is unattested in historiography. Historiography rather denotes a wide assortment of sequences and types of events, but something that we can note with surety is the denomination and isolation of themes by the organizers, done both consciously and unconsciously. The hunting of beasts, the destruction of these great monsters was the exhibition of Roman might. The combat of gladiators was the veneration of the martial spirit of Rome that was so focal for Roman culture and politics. And the damnation by beasts was the inducement of Roman ideas about justice, the sophistic regurgitation of what they thought natural justice was or should have been, which is a roundabout that took them to that gratification of their evil instincts, darker urges that are born in adversity, or sometimes in nothing other than humanity itself. There were Romans who wasted their time on objections. One is the younger Seneca, the famous one. In his 7th moralizing letter to his friend Lucilius, some procurator of Syracuse, he lambasts crowds and their influence, something that we today might call groupthink. He warns against its influence on young people by claiming that even those among the great elders should be considered as pervious to the corruptions of the crowd. The young character which cannot hold fast to righteousness must be rescued from the mob. It is too easy to side with the majority. Even Socrates, Cato, and Laelius might have been shaken in their moral strength by a crowd that was unlike them. So true it is that none of us, no matter how much he cultivates his abilities, can withstand the shock of faults that approach, as it were, with so great a retinue. He alleges many demoralizing and demoralizing effects of being caught up in the tall waves of a crowd's emotional output that are put out by less than desirable states of mind, namely, as named by him, greed, ambition, and cruelty, that are not only allowed to roam free in the setting of a munus, but are its main attractions. Mass entertainment of choice of Rome wasn't exactly the wildly popular poetry readings of Athens. Seneca goes on about the crowds. To consort with the crowd is harmful. There is no person who does not make some vice attractive to us, or stamp it upon us, or taint us unconsciously therewith. Certainly, the greater the mob with which we mingle, the greater the danger. But nothing is so damaging to good character as the habit of lounging at the games, for then it is that vice steals subtly upon one through the avenue of pleasure. As for the source of the above-mentioned crowd's pleasure, it is argued over by the sages whether his revulsion was directed at the cruelty of the games, or at their vulgarity, the tastelessness of the affair. I'll let you judge for yourself as I read from the letter. I do so also because the letter gives a general idea of what it was like to be present at one of these events. I happened to go to one of these shows at the time of the lunch hour interlude, expecting there to be some light and witty entertainment then, some respite for the purpose of affording people's eyes a rest from human blood. Far from it. All the earlier contests were charity in comparison. The nonsense is dispensed with now. What we have now is murder pure and simple. The combatants have nothing to protect them. Their whole bodies are exposed to the blows. Every thrust they launch gets home. A great many spectators prefer this to the ordinary matches, and even to the special popular demand ones. And quite naturally, there are no helmets and no shields repelling the weapons. What is the point of armor or of skill? All that sort of thing just makes the death slower in coming. In the morning, men are thrown to the lions and the bears. but it is the spectators they are thrown to in the lunch hour. The spectators insist that each, on killing his man, shall be thrown against another to be killed in his turn, and the eventual victor is reserved by them for some other form of butchery. The only exit for the contestants is death. Fire and steel keep the slaughter going, and all this happens while the arena is virtually empty. But he was a highway robber, he killed a man, and what of it? Granted that as a murderer he deserved his punishment. But what have you done, you wretched fellow, to deserve to watch it? Kill him, flog him, burn him. Why does he run at the other man's weapon in such a cowardly way? Why isn't he less half-hearted about killing? Why isn't he a bit more enthusiastic about dying? Whip him forward to get his wounds. Make them each offer the other a bare breast and trade blow for blow on them. And when there is an interval in the show, let's have some throats cut in the meantime so that there's something happening. Come now, I say, surely you people realize, if you realize nothing else, that bad examples have a way of recoiling on those who set them. Give thanks to the immortal gods that the men to whom you are giving a lesson in cruelty are not in a position to profit from it. Cicero, though not so egregious in his views, was too himself a buzzkill, for expressing a general lament for the fate of the beasts, as well as a lament at the unoriginality of their fates, and for being outraged that he had witnessed a spectator from the crowd be thrown to the beasts for the sole wrongdoing of being indecent, or as some translators have taken to mean ugly. He did, however, have to say something slightly redeeming of the crowds at these animal hunts. The last day was that of the elephants, on which there was a great deal of astonishment on the part of the vulgar crowd, but no pleasure whatever. Nay, there was even a certain feeling of compassion aroused by it, and a kind of a belief created that that animal has something in common with mankind. Cicero and Seneca weren't the only dissenting voices. Stoics, for example, were no fun about it as a general rule, but in spite of these spoil sports, to most Romans their discernments were superfluous, pontificating, and gods forbid Christian. Those of you who know some early history of Christianity in the Roman Empire might form an idea of your own about why Christians might be opposed to people being thrown to lions. But the Romans, as a monolith, had no argument against it. The common gods-fearing people, with the exceptions such as the crowd Cicero describes as having had a hard-on for elephants, they were much more devil-may-care about the whole ado of trying to rationalize, reconcile, review, realize. But some numbers of elevated citizens were above neglecting rationalization, if not above employing rationalization. I haven't yet a settled opinion on whether glorification in the context that I will now describe is the same as rationalization. But again, I implore you to employ your own biases and prejudices. Barbarian Memphis, be mute o'er the pyramids' wonders, and you Assyrians stop bleating of Babylon. No praise for tender Ionians and Diana's trivial temple, and may Apollo's many-horned altar bury Delos deep. Don't let the Carians cry extravagant words to the sky regarding the mausoleum that hangs in vacuous air. All efforts now give way to Caesar's new amphitheatre. Fame can speak of the one, and that can do for them all. With these words, Martial honored the Flavian amphitheatre and its patron, Emperor Titus, shortly after its opening. He advertised the gore of the Colosseum to tourists, detailing it vividly, imploring people to come to bear witness to it. Martial exalted the games and the rectitude of the punishments they inflicted, speaking about how criminals and animals deserve no better. Think of Prometheus, tied to the Scythian crag, feeding the tireless bird of prey with his too abundant thorax. Just so, Laureolus, hanging on the mock theatrical cross, gave his naked guts to a Scottish bear. His lacerated limbs lived on, dripping gore, and in all his body body there was none. Finally he met with the punishment he deserved. The guilty wretch had plunged a sword into his father's throat, or his master's, or in his madness had robbed a temple of its secret gold, or laid a cruel torch to Rome. A perfidious lion with ungrateful jaws had wounded his keeper, having dared to attack with violence the hands so well known to him. But worthy of such a crime was the offender's punishment, and he who would not submit to correction succumbed to weapons. What should be the character of men under such a prince, who bids the savage nature of brutes become more gentle? I am not sure whether his opinions are a manner of rationalization, because calling it so in the context of a modern perspective implies that in said rationalization there is an attempted negation of sadism and redemption of humanity that would be expected from a modern thinker. But Roman, and more specifically Martial's, definition of humanity differs from ours, attributing a different set of rights to humans, and his definition of sadism is either inexistent, impudent, or even indulgent. It's indulgent. But let us now turn to the indifferent. One such was Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger, who once described himself as a pale imitation of Cicero, wrote in a letter to Valerius Maximus, some politician who never made it to Wikipedia, and not the favorite ancient author of the medieval ages, to congratulate him on the success of having put on a great spectacle for the people of Verona. Verona does seem to have a tendency to be a setting for some great spectacles. They never do end well, though. You did perfectly right in promising a gladiatorial combat to our good friends, the citizens of Verona, who have long loved, looked up to, and honored you. Well, it was from that city, too, you received that amiable object of your most tender affection, your late excellent wife. And since you owed some monument or public representation to her memory, what other spectacle could you have exhibited more appropriate to the occasion? Besides, you were so unanimously pressed to do so that to have refused would have looked more like hardness than resolution. Pliny declares the games to have turned out a worthy dedication to the funeral of Valerius Maximus's wife, and much like a modern political aide would, he stresses the optics of his decision when he says, to have refused would have looked more like hardness than resolution. It is worth noting again here that gladiatorial bouts began as a funerary tradition in early Rome, when men were forced to die in honor of the death of someone whose life actually was worth something. Pliny isn't exactly moved by such a thing, neither to indignation nor jubilation. He finds the dedication of the games to be a socially appropriate and an apt means to a political end, namely the cajolery of the people. He shows no strong emotion about the act beyond his congratulation of the achievement of the goal. He finishes the letter by reassuring Maximus that the delayed arrival of the Panthers, due to a shipping issue, wasn't his fault, and abruptly bids him farewell. Hannah Arendt's words come to mind. Eichmann would have done well to learn the virtue of mercy from Caesar. In fact, if he had kissed the dictator's notoriously vain bum cheeks enough times, perhaps Caesar might have had him in upper management in his war machine's well-organized genocide of Gaul, next to Titus Labienus, Aemon Goeth, and Radovan Karadzic. And then there were those that had some lateral moral objections. Statius, a contemporary of Martial, focuses not on the human suffering, but on the depravity of subjugating a great despoiler like a lion. Unlike Martial, who is annoyed at the perfidious lion who dares to violate and harm his master, Statius, in his poem The Tamed Lion, bemoans that such an expert killer has been brought so low as to endure command and obey a lesser master. He begins the poem with a little bit of irony by asking, "What good did it do you to be tamed, you who had shown your age? What good did it do to forget crime and human killings?" Showing his disdain for the dulling of the noble killer instinct, he then involves his lion pals in his emotional project. "Your unlucky cage stands open. and around the locked doors on all sides the tame lions swelled with rage that this disgrace has been allowed. All their manes fell, and they were ashamed to see your body brought back, and they brought their foreheads down to their eyes in a frown. He ends the poem by testing the popularity of his sentiment, a sentiment and crowd reminiscent of the one Cicero describes, though whether Statius's sentiment arose independently of that popularity is something you might ask Seneca. Anyway, this is what Statius says. The sorrowful people and senators have mourned you, as if you were a well-known gladiator falling in the sad sands of the arena, and because the loss of one lion has touched Domitianus, one lion among so many insignificant wild beasts from Scythia, Libya, Germany, and Aegyptus. Emperor Domitian's sorrow is significant when leveled against the context of the time. He had recently defeated some Germanic tribes whose yellow manes, wild beastly nature, and pathetic state of submission is comparable to that of the lions. Yet any grievances about the oppression of nations or about the instances of human beings being torn apart living in the arena are absent from Statius's writing. Now, I wasn't decided about whether to go over the Christians, as they were always a tangential voice on the subject, since they were a part of a whole other fabric of belief systems that diverged too far from Roman or even the broadly international doctrine on virtues, metaphysics, and experience of existence in general. Therefore, their opinions would be immaterial to trying to understand why the hell Romans, the ones that most people imagine in their heads at the mention of the word, would cause a person such a great inconvenience such as the damnatio ad bestias is. But Christians were increasingly a tangible part of Roman society into the imperial period, for a long time before the empire adopted Christianity even. So I decided not to leave them unseen. They were the biggest critics of the games, perhaps the most famous Christian voice of the era, and perhaps the most famous voice in Christianity as a whole is Saint Augustine of Hippo. He lived in a period when Rome's population and governing apparatus had been sincerely Christianized. His reception of the games mirrors that of Seneca in revilement of the crowds. In The Story of Alypius, St. Augustine condemns the crowds by similar crimes as those alleged by Seneca, the most outstanding similarity being in his Seneca concurrent notion that you shouldn't believe yourself to be impervious to the effects of the crowd. In the story, Alypius goes to an event of the games confident in his ability to not be drawn in by the satisfaction of those basest human appeals. This is a failure. Augustine deviates from Seneca in then saying that he failed at governing his sentiments because Alypius put his faith in himself rather than in God. Conversing directly with God, St. Augustine writes, "He was not now the person who had come in, but just one of the crowd which he had joined, and a true member of the group which had brought him. What should I add? He looked, he yelled, he was on fire, he took the madness home with him, so that it urged him to return, and not only with those by whom he had originally been drawn there, but even more than them, taking others with him. Nevertheless, from this you delivered him by your most strong and merciful hand, and you taught him to put his confidence not in himself, but in you." This Seneca-St. Augustine dynamic isn't all that unique to philosophy, religion, or the past. Comparable incongruent concurrences, in other words, similar conflicting agreements, can be found in the juxtaposition of the baser level of modern self-help books and modern evangelical scripture. And before you start railing at me not to compare Seneca to modern inspirationalists, individualists, sophists, I will quote Seneca for the 4th time. "Lay these words to heart, Lucilius, that you may scorn the pleasure which comes from the applause of the majority. Many men praise you, but have you any reason for being pleased with yourself, if you are a person whom the many can understand?" Now, if that isn't scorn for mass appeal, packaged for mass appeal, I suppose I must not know what it is. Christianity had its own brand of mass appeal that stood at wild variance with some of the tenets of the polytheisms it replaced. Perhaps purposely so, but that is a different conversation. So it is little wonder that a man who has been canonized as a saint had proclaimed a disparaging view of those that looked to wickedness of fighting as ones filled with savage passion. It was these radical views that contrasted paganism and helped supplant it. An early Christian of the pre-Christian era of the empire, known as the father of Latin Christianity, and canonized and rejected as a church father by both the Eastern and Western Catholic churches, for having ideas about things like the nature of the Trinity, despite having quite possibly introduced the word into Latin text, that didn't quite make it to or past the great uptick of the 4th century. Tertullian of Carthage, in his own On the Spectacles, decried the pagan wickedness and savagery of the games. If we can maintain that it is right to indulge in the cruel and the impious and the fierce, let us go there. If we are what we are said to be, let us regale ourselves there with human blood. It is good, no doubt, to have the guilty punished. Who but the criminal himself will deny that? And yet the innocent can find no pleasure in another's suffering. He rather mourns that a brother has sinned so heinously as to need a punishment so dreadful. Notice the incongruent concurrence with Seneca, when Seneca says, "Granted that as a murderer he deserved this punishment, but what have you done, you wretched fellow, to deserve to watch it?" But who is my guarantee that it is always the guilty are judged to the wild beasts or to some other doom, and that the guiltless never suffer from the revenge of the judge, or the weakness of the defense, or the pressure of the rack? How much better, then, is it for me to remain ignorant of the punishment inflicted on the wicked, lest I am obliged to know also of the good coming to untimely ends, if I may speak of goodness in that case at all? At any rate, gladiators not chargeable with crime are offered in sale for the games, that they may become the victims of the public pleasure. Even in the case of those who are judicially condemned to the amphitheatre, what a monstrous thing it is that, in undergoing their punishment, they, from some less serious delinquency, advance to the criminality of manslayers. But I mean these remarks for heathen. As to Christians, I shall not insult them by adding another word as to the aversion with which they should regard this sort of exhibition, though no one is more able than myself to set forth fully the whole subject, unless it be one who is still in the habit of going to the shows. I would rather withal be incomplete than set memory a-working. Here, in his words, we see some embryonic versions of our modern ideas about morality and secular law. But do not be swept up by this. The Catholics did not reject him based only on the incompatibility of his and their Trinitarian pedanticisms. He also held some ideas about prohibiting widows from finding love again, and Christians not being allowed to flee persecution. Gandhi is a modern example of someone who employs such pacifist practices effectively, but he knew he lived in a time and place for them. Then again, not fleeing persecution was one of the features of Christianity that fanned its fervor. It impressed people who had no notion of a God that could threaten and promise enough to get someone to agree to be crucified, burned, or fed to the lions. The fanatical sacrifice that these people made grew the profile and resultant power of Christianity until the turn of the 5th century, when a Christian monk named Telemachus made an attempt to put an end to a bout of the games, and the crowd in their fury murdered him. It was this that prompted the Emperor Honorius to end the tradition of the games in 404 AD, although the proclamation had to ripple through the empire a few times until the bloodbath went completely still. However, during that stillness, the Christians got busy eroding pagan rituals, institutions, power bases, and general support. You can't just start slaughtering the majority of your population. Once pagans were no longer the majority, and no longer a significant minority, the Christians turned the tap back on.